Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. This is the second part of a series on reimagining resourcing for social transformation. And in this episode, I have a conversation with Katharine Im-Jenkins, who is a longtime friend, co-conspirator, and the managing director of the Equality Fund. So we talk through endowments. What are the power dynamics within endowments? Some of the history in setting up the Equality Fund, a sort of monumental effort by the Canadian government. And what are some of the power dynamics? How has the Equality Fund addressed them? And what is possible in this moment and moving forward? Enjoy.
For 23 years, Criterion Institute has revealed new possibilities for how finance can be used for systems change. Our progress has been deeply rooted in the partnerships we've built, partnerships with people willing to use their power to challenge the status quo and accelerate change. We simply couldn't do our work without them. On the 14th of May, we invite you to join us for Insights and Invitations, where current and prospective partners meet others doing complex systems change work and expand their imagination about how finance might be used for change. To find out more, visit criterioninstitute.org.
Hey, Kat. So glad to have you here and have this conversation.
Hi, Joy. Great to be here and really looking forward to our conversation today.
And we're here and we're going to talk about Equality Fund and their role in reimagining resourcing as that sort of this broader conversation that we're trying to have in this moment about what we can do to resource feminist movement, grassroots organizations working on gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. But you and I go pretty far back, right? We go back before you were. I was so thrilled when I found out that you landed at the Equality Fund, actually. But I miss you at WUSC, right? Because who introduced us in the end? I forget.
Yeah, we do go a ways back. So I think our mutual friend, Ted Jackson, who, is a great academic and consultant in the GLI space, is the one who originally connected us.
But we got to hang out at WUSC, and we still partner with WUSC in all kinds of ways. So
yes, it's a beautiful and small community in the end. Folks who are working on GLI and sort of this idea of translation and reimagining how we do things and pushing that envelope. So I've always loved our conversations on those themes in wherever I have been working.
Well, and in the small world category, just to lead into the Equality Fund, I also had a role with the government on the Equality Fund. So the Global Affairs Canada, just to put this a little bit in context, invited me to join an external advisory board, which you know this well, but just for the folks listening, naming as we're talking about the Equality Fund, I was part of the initial advisory board that reviewed the applications and gave some level of advice to the government as they were selecting between multiple applications. And you know the history maybe even better than me, but there was this moment, right, where the Canadian government did something bold that still hasn't been done by any other government. What exactly were they doing? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, so take us back a few years. I think the government of Canada very boldly put out a feminist international assistance policy that really said, we're going to put women and girls at the heart of all of our development programming. And part of that that new policy was a signature initiative that they called the Partnership for Gender Equality, which was, a very bold commitment of $300 million to a collaboration or an initiative that was going to advance gender equality using innovative financing as an approach, and really crowd in other partners and other resources to that effort, all with the goal of ultimately improving the lives of women and girls and gender expansive people in the global South. So there was a lot of excitement and momentum when that happened. And, Joy, you were part of sort of the advisory team, Equality Fund. We were part of the sort of putting together an idea that was ultimately chosen by the Government of Canada.
And if I think about those there were 2 phases in the selection process. And I remember being struck in the first phase that the focus of many of the applications was on innovative finance, gender lens investing. This was seen as, woohoo, gender lens investing gets to have its moment with a $300 million fund and all of these creative things we could do in investing. And I remember sitting on that committee, and I was one of the few people, most of the people on that committee were from philanthropy, from women's rights organizations. I was one of the folks that leaned a little bit more into the investment world. And I remember thinking, well, isn't this about resourcing organizations in the global South, not resourcing the field of gender lens investing? And I got really convicted about that early on. Of what was exciting about this was that essentially, right, if the government could put out $10, $20, $30 million a year towards funding for grassroots, like funding for on the ground, shifting norms, challenging the deeper stuff, like not big development programs that tick lots of boxes, but on the ground, really supporting local grassroots efforts to address gender equality, that this became a permanent way to have funding that moved in that direction, even if, say, the government changed, which, of course, this week, your Canadian government didn't actually shift which government was in power, or which party was in power, but it definitely was on the table that would have happened, at which point, all of a sudden, the funding would have dried up. And so the Equality Fund was meant to be a permanent, perpetual, to introduce that word, way of funding grassroots organizations working on complex gender issues, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty of putting out an invitation like the Government of Canada did with the Partnership for Gender Equality is that you get sort of a diversity of innovative ideas, a diversity of partners putting forward different possibilities and coming together in new ways. And I know that it was a very competitive process. There were a lot of really exciting ideas that were put forward. But I can only speak to sort of Equality Fund and sort of what was driving our thinking and the design that we proposed. And that was really informed by an experience that we had as Match International, which was to be a small organization delivering programming in partnership with women's organizations globally, and reliant on one single government grant, really, for the bulk of our programming. And to have that grant not renewed, sort of with not very much notice, in a time where, the political and public support from a funding perspective for gender equality was not strong. And so that experience really informed what I would call, and this is framing that Criterion Institute has put forward, a feminist financial imagination around how do we design something that prevents that too common story or experience that, social justice organizations face. And so for us, that meant a few things in terms of design. One, really, thinking about scale and working with this sizable number and really inviting other partners to that. So taking this $300 million initial contribution and really thinking about how it could be leveraged. And then also really thinking about sustainability. So the work of social change, as we all know is not linear, and it takes generations. And it's a long arc. So this idea that funding could stop or start on a dime, or with a change in priorities of either a philanthropy or a government, we wanted to design something that could stand the test of time and really provide a sustainable sort of platform for resourcing gender equality work globally. And so that's where sort of the endowment component of our design became so important.
And I do think that was, that sort of vision paired with the government intent to say, in 1 year, we'll put $300 million towards something that we exist to last beyond that year, right? The reality is, I don't know, I taught high school in Brooklyn, New York, and budgets were annual. They weren't multi-year, let's think about what plays out. Like, from a government's perspective, the money comes in and it's got to go out within that budget year. And so the sort of vision of the government saying, let's put $300 million into something that's going to continue to give out money, right? If we think about the moment we're in right now with USAID, may it rest in peace, right? This sort of shift in, all of a sudden, these long-term commitments are not ever actually long-term commitments. They're annualized, or they're given out in 5-year programs or whatever, but they are annual commitments. And I think that shift from the tyranny of annual government funding to a perpetual instrument was also really important in the design of how the government put it together, because it couldn't, from a promise to the integrity of what they said, they couldn't put out something that they said was going to last for a long time and have it disappear in 3 years, because the intent was, we'll give you way more money than we normally give you so that you have perpetual funding, not so that you come back for another $300 million in 2 years. And this isn't to say, should there be more money going out from governments to funding women's rights organizations? Exactly. Should they be giving that much money? That's a bigger argument than we can handle today. The reality is they don't. And so this was a way within that context to try to give it more permanence. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I would say, this is still a very bold thing that the Government of Canada has done. I think it's very outside of their usual ways of working, which are, traditionally sort of 5-year grants or 1-year grants that get renewed. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which we don't need to get into. But I think by doing this in the way that they did, with a one-time transfer of funds, it was a way to shift power. And that was part of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And, as part of that, we do have a 15-year partnership with the Government of Canada, where we have agreed to a whole number of accountabilities in terms of how we steward these resources, the grant making, the way we're investing these resources with a gender lens, and also how we are building partnerships and inviting others to join this table to really scale this effort that's been seeded by the Government of Canada. So absolutely, it is quite unique. But I would say it's the kind of thing we need more of in the future, as we look at a whole bunch of disruption in all sectors that we're working in, and also the risk of a lot of fragmentation of efforts. And I think there's a recognition that by coming together, we can be more effective and more resilient.
Well, and that maybe transitions into thinking a little bit about the instrument that was chosen, right? And in the end, this was put into an endowment. And so one of the things that we've been talking to, Criterion's been talking to Equality Institute for a while, and then we wrote this white paper on years ago, but we're finally getting it out now, of sort of looking at endowments, examining it as a structure. And I was just looking, the New York Times, given the focus on Harvard and its endowment right now, and can they just take $3 billion out of the endowment and cover the cuts that are potentially coming from the government? There was this line in this New York Times article that was basically like, there's lots of PowerPoints with pictures of piggy banks and lines crossed through them, right? That they're like, endowments are not the same as even reserve funds.
Yes.
Or
it's not a bank account.
And it's not a bank account, right? It is not an account that exists for operating expenses. It exists to generate revenue off of investments, and then you spend the revenue from investments. And so the whole point is to have a corpus. And if the corpus grows, great. If the corpus shrinks, you actually decrease how much revenue you get from it, because again, the investments that are coming from the endowment, that are coming from the corpus of the endowment, are the benefit to whatever social cause we're talking about. And that's true of any foundation, right? It's the spending structures within that. And so I think the good news about endowments is that they can create this sort of what we've just been talking about, right? This long-term financial stability, right? Financial sustainability, that there is money over time going out. It has a hedge against fluctuations. If donors go up or down, an endowment, whether or not it sits under the governance of an individual organization like a foundation, or the governance of a NGO itself, right? A non-governmental organization that has its own endowment, that like Harvard, or I don't know, my local church has a little tiny endowment that like every year produces some part of our budget. And so that hedging is really important, because donors come and go, and they shift, and their priorities can shift. And I think the last piece that's actually kind of cool about endowments, and I'm curious if you see this within the Equality Fund, but it signals a kind of financial discipline, right? So if you're an organization that has an endowment, it says you have a piggy bank that you're not breaking every day, right? You're not smashing it to the ground, pulling all the money and using it for whatever you need today, that there's a financial discipline that comes with it. And I think one of the things that's really cool about the Equality Fund is that signals to the world women's rights organizations are important. Grassroots organizations working on gender equality are important, and they deserve sustained funding. They're not the flavor of the week. And so that kind of And that there is a fiscal discipline behind that they can be supported, and that they have their own budgets, and that all of this can work, and it isn't just pixie dust.
Absolutely. I think no financial tool is going to be perfect. They're all deeply flawed, and there are trade-offs when you make different choices. But I think certainly from our experience, all of the things that you mentioned, Joy, are really important features in terms of why we chose an endowment structure. We don't have an exclusive endowment structure. We can get into that because there are some limits. And so we've designed to be what we would call ourselves a non-traditional endowment, where we're, taking a gender lens in the way that we're stewarding the resources, where we are grappling with sort of the amount of money that we pull from the endowment, combining that with other revenue sources to enable sort of this tension of money that is available now or in the future, and sort of hedging that fluctuation in donor contribution, but also the time horizon. And I think the strongest thing in terms of the signal that we can send to the world, as you put it, is that we're going to be here for the long term. This social change work takes generations, and to our partners in particular, that we're going to have their back when an earthquake strikes, or when, the global official development assistance structure is upended. Equality Fund is going to be here, and to be a resilient sort of backbone for resourcing social movements to the extent that we can, given our role. And I think that's very powerful.
Yeah. It's a cool piece in that I am well aware that you had leverage goals from the government of Canada, right? The additionality, as it's often talked about, right? $300 million needs to translate to more than $300 million and not just through investment returns. But just framing that differently, I spent a lot of my life working with women's funds, and Match was a women's fund as the organization that spun this out. And in some ways, you've kind of got the best of both, right? Most women's funds don't actually have an endowment, but they do active fundraising. They build awareness around issues. They, have access. Teresa Younger used to be on our and Criterion's board, and so she and I are good friends, and she just talks about the ability for the Ms. Foundation to have access to organizations that nobody else has access to, right? That work of staying connected that women's funds are so good at. And so you're kind of, but again, most women's funds are pass-through foundations, right? They raise the money for the year and they spend it, and maybe they have a little endowment. And so you're kind of this best of both worlds, right? You've got an endowment, but you're also leveraging those resources, bringing in additional dollars, figuring out how to hold up the. Do I have it right?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think what we're trying to do with our model is, as to borrow some Criterion language, is to stitch the system of a whole bunch of different systems and models that we're familiar with, right? Grant making from global philanthropy, or official development assistance, donations from individuals, the stewardship of an endowment, but to really stitch all of these things together into a fulsome model that really leverages the best of what each has to offer, and then sort of manage sort of the downside of what each of those systems offers.
So to that downside, endowments as a part of your model. And the bulk of your money, like the core, right? The equality fund setup.
The financial engine, as we like to call it.
The which?
The financial engine, as we like to call it.
Exactly. So endowments, on the downside, only work if capital markets are successful, right? Like at some level, as all of our holdings decline, as the stock market declines, that happens to endowments as well. I mean, there's a lot of hedges that get put inside, not just hedge funds, but hedges in different ways, and to sort of mitigate that, but they still do that. They also, and this is the criticism that's often made, they tie up a meaningful amount of dollars that become unavailable for anything except investments in the stock market or in bonds or whatever. The money is being used in economic activity to generate returns, not being used for the social mission. And that's where they always get criticized. We should spend it all. Well, the reality is you can't, if you spend it, you're not using it to make money, right? And I think there's sort of an interesting piece to say, what kinds of assets do you need to be able to generate revenue that then can be used for programming? Classic issue, right? So, but it does tie up that funding. It does favor future challenges of the unknown world, maybe balanced against what's going on now, right? It's kind of future oriented. It says, this is always going to be with us. There's no big spend down that we could happen right now that means that we won't have these problems in the future. So we're focused on anticipating the problems in the future. And sometimes, if the money's locked up for too long, the value of the dollar can decline, right? And that's sort of, you have to make money against inflation, right? So in an inflationary period, the value of endowments goes down against its spend. So there's a bunch of sort of financial machinations that happen inside of endowments because they are a very particular thing, and they are invested in very particular ways, right? A lot of this was built out of Harvard and Yale and others who sort of became the model for, a balanced portfolio, that is an endowment model, right? Cambridge Associates then spun out of Harvard to be able to sort of be how endowments get managed. There's a lot of criticism out there of that in the world, but there's a set of assumptions behind it that drive what everybody does within this world. That is, in the world of norms in finance, how endowments get managed, and that diversification model is kind of religion in the world of finance. But it does mean that we're working inside of the norms of finance in some ways more than almost any other financial instrument I've ever seen.
Yes, I would agree with you that the norms of finance are incredibly powerful. And much of the sort of the downside that you've articulated is absolutely real and is our experience. I think we have, in the way we've designed our endowment and our broader sort of organizational model, tried to account for those downsides and grapple with those tensions and those trade-offs. But I think these are real and important, and so I'm glad you've raised them. So I would say, in terms of this idea that the money is tied up, for us, that's okay in some ways, in that we want to be here for the long term. And so that's a conscious choice that we've made. That's really what we're trying to do, is to try to get out of this 1 to 5 year grant cycle. And we understand that there are trade-offs for that. And so that means only some of that money is available in this moment, so that more can be available in the future. And so, that's something that we have to sort of own and accept and understand. But how we kind of account for that is that our endowment is not our only revenue model. So we are also building funding partnerships with other governments and other philanthropies for whom we can sort of take their grant contributions to Equality Fund and quickly be resourcing women's rights organizations. And so we're not just sort of quote unquote sitting on our endowment. We are, playing with multiple tools and multiple levers to sort of balance what each tool can individually do, but by putting it together in sort of a comprehensive model, playing to the upside of what each tool can offer, but also mitigating the downside of what each tool offers. I think the other thing is that in terms of like having this money, and is it working towards gender equality? That's such a part of why we've made such an effort to design 100% gender lens endowment with in each asset class sort of specific products that are advancing gender related goals in the context of that money. And so it is contributing in different ways than social justice work does, but it is contributing to gender equality more broadly. And so that's very important, that money is not just, sitting there in capital markets. It's being stewarded in such a way where it's contributing to our mission as an organization.
Yeah, really well said. And there isn't a comparison between like what funding, what capital markets can do in public equities and what a women's rights organization can do on the ground. Like those are apples and squirrels. Like, I was gonna say, I was actually thinking kumquats, but I went to how far different could we be? Let's go with apples and squirrels eating kumquats, like something different. So within that, you end up with things that are quite different. So within this, the question that everybody's asking is sort of, and so what can you do in this moment, right? How can you respond? Because in May, can't believe it's already May of 2025, 100 days into, you get to have congratulations again on your choice of a government in Canada. We're living with 100 days into a selection that was made here last year and dealing with that. And so how are you responding? But I also say, like, Trump wasn't the only reason that there were problems in the feminist funding movement. Like, there have been disruptions happening for the last year that have been pretty dramatic in terms of shifting priorities.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that the sort of the USAID closure is getting the most attention, but across Europe and in the UK, there have been a number of similar reductions, not full sort of dismantling of aid, but significant reductions in the billions. And also, similarly, some traditional philanthropic partners have stepped back, others have stepped forward. So there's sort of a mix of things going on, as there always will be. But we are certainly in a moment of I think, resource constraints. And that's something that we, feel very acutely in terms of our role as an organization to be, resourcing movements to do the work that they need to do to build the world that we all want to live in. And it does feel like there are really powerful headwinds in this particular moment. And so, we have to respond in the immediate term and also really take a long-term perspective to, the social change work that we are supporting, and to how we sort of play that role. So, through our endowment, I mean, there are, I think, calls from folks rightfully to sort of question sort of the annual allocations that philanthropic organizations and endowments use to say, if you're waiting for a crisis, maybe now is the crisis. And, this idea of perpetuity for what is being questioned, and I think very rightfully so. I think each organization has to make its own sort of decision around its purpose and what that means. I think for us, it without getting into the complexities of our financial model, we sort of designed ourselves to not pull too much from the endowment in our early years, because we wanted it to be invested well and to start to generate a predictable amount of returns that we could then allocate into our operating budget each year. And so we're actually, given our trajectory as an organization, we're turning 5 this year. Now planning, this was always the plan, to take a significant amount out of our endowment this year, more than any year before. And that was part of sort of the design. But, given the circumstances, that feels especially like the right thing to do. But we have to sort of weigh that with, we can't go further than we've decided to without sacrificing sort of future commitments that feel important to us to make. And there's a real tension there. And I can assure you, we've had a lot of challenging conversations across the board and the staff around what's the right thing to do here. The other thing I would say is that's sort of how the calculus with the endowment. But, we also do philanthropic advocacy. We also are looking for resources for funding movements more broadly. And so, that's where sort of having an endowment, but also other levers for change is important to us in this moment.
Yeah, it's really cool. And it gets to also, I just recognizing 5 years old as an organization. I mean, Criterion's 25, and I still feel like we're figuring stuff out. So just recognizing that you have accomplished a lot to stand up an organization in 5 years with a lot of complexity, working with a government in a relationship that was new to both of you, and therefore bumps in the road have emerged, right? This hasn't been just an easy sailing of 5 years. And so I think what's really interesting is to just remind that you are one of those efforts that was a systems change effort that also needs more than 5 minutes to figure out how you actually work. So maybe we can talk some of the things, because I think the other piece that you're, just from my vantage point, I get to see a bunch of this. But there's a bunch of power dynamics that you are continuing to address in how Equality Fund is designed as an organization itself, right? You have, as far as I can tell, extraordinary, maybe also extraordinarily complex, but you have an extraordinary governance structure, right? You were set up so that you're not just Kat and a few others making decisions, right? You have a you have these feedback mechanisms, you have boards in place, because I think one of the things that can be that endowments require, right? They sit underneath the board of directors of whoever. They require governance. And so your intentionality in setting up good governance has taken a lot of effort, yeah?
Yes, I would say. And I think, it's just a lot of work to set up anything new, as anyone listening could attest to. But given the complexity of what we're trying to do and the fact that there's no roadmap, certainly I think has been challenging. I think, we also launched we were announced, and then our first launch year was in the COVID period. And so that was a very high moment of disruption. And the moment we're in right now also feels similarly disrupted in terms of the amount of change we're experiencing at one time. But we are fundamentally a feminist organization with a power analysis built into our DNA, and there has been quite a lot of intention in terms of how we've designed, our endowment, recognizing that we're working within, very flawed systems of capitalism, capital markets, ODA, philanthropy, which have, I think colonial and racist and patriarchal legacies. And so we are trying to do it differently while working within these systems. And that's a real, I think, exciting opportunity. That's why so many of us are, wake up every day and are excited to go and really, really do that. But it isn't easy, I would say, because the norms are so powerful and these systems are so deeply ingrained.
And in some ways, you're trying to bridge two worlds, right? And the feminist leaders from the global South that govern your organization mm-hmm. are not necessarily coming from a background of, this is my third board that I've been on managing a $300 million endowment. So they bring really important alternative perspectives. But also, there's a bridge that needs to be built between expertise so that it can make sense. I do think that there's also you brought up the sort of broader fundraising climate, and you and I talk a lot about what's going on with Gender Funders Collab, which is sort of a remarkable effort to bring together the foundations working on women's rights. But that context, Gender Funders Collab was such a huge partner in sort of vouching, here's a set of foundations, Gates, Ford, others that are going to stand with the Equality Fund to assure the Canadian government that you're not alone. But some of the commitments inside of that, of Wellspring and Oak and others, have actually shifted, right? So it's not just that you're standing alone, but the core partners who were around you are also shifting. And so, just curious how you see the sort of power dynamics around that.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of power dynamics at play in terms of being embedded in different systems and being in partnership with so many. Our North Star is, an accountability to funding feminist movements and to resourcing them in as much as we can in the ways in which they wish to be. So with core and flexible resourcing. And so, our role as, we see ourselves as like resource activists. That's sort of our version of activism when we come to work, is to grapple with all of those dynamics, to build trusting partnerships. And that takes time because these sectors, these organizations, and even these individuals are not used to being around the table together. And that's the beauty of Equality Fund and what we're trying to do. And it's very cool to be part of some of those conversations. But it's not easy because folks come with, lack of knowledge of each other's work, of each other's realities. Each industry sort of has its own jargon and norms. And so there's a lot to break down to then be able to build back up a common vision that, takes at value sort of the concerns of a global South activist and global North philanthropist and an impact investor. Like our board is an amazing board because we have 18 folks from all over the world from different sectors who really come together and learn from each other and then build this sort of common vision for our organization.
And that does go back to just in general power dynamics in endowments. The reality is endowments require investment management. The size of your endowment defines how much voice you have in that investment management, because in the end, $300 million, and I often try to remind the Canadian government that $300 million in the world of endowments is actually not that much money, right? Like, the people who have big influence in how investment designs happen are at a bigger scale than that, right? You're able to do some cool things like launching this ETF and other pieces, but you're not as big a player as, say, Harvard or some of the bigger pension funds where
one day, Joanna, one day.
I don't
Feminists will have as much assets as Harvard.
Not sure that's even a goal, right? That's an absurd amount of, it's a large economy, there's a whole economy sitting in one institution. But I do think thinking right now about also your voice with those investment managers who are saying, sweetie, this is how it works, you have to follow us, but has also played a role for the Equality Fund to say, does it have to work that way? Can we try some different models? Can we push in a different direction without upending the whole system?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you raised that, because that's a big part of what we do, internal to Equality Fund. So we had a very thoughtful process to pick our investment manager, and both sort of the technical capabilities in terms of asset management experience were front of mind, but also the kind of partner that would be willing to and excited to work with us in terms of building a portfolio that is 100% gender lens investment, that is trying to innovate in terms of the products that we are invested in, to capture that impact data, to really be active in sort of our vision for what we want to do with the portfolio. And so I think we've been very privileged to be working with Rock Creek Group for the last number of years in that journey. And it is a push and pull. So, they are an experienced asset manager. They have a number of clients and I would say, are working within the sort of traditional norms of what's expected. But we've done things like develop gender lens investment criteria that, was a very collaborative process, both with Rock Creek, but also our Global Investment Advisory Council, other investment sort of organizations that collect data like GIN and Equileap, that 2X criterion, number of folks that we talk to help us say, like, this is sort of what we feel is a strong standard for gender lens investment and how Equality Fund wishes to have our assets invested. And so that's an example of how we've grappled with the power dynamic with our asset manager to sort of say, like, hey, this is important. And this is, a concrete tool that we expect you to use as you're making investment decisions on our behalf. And it's something that we, in terms of our hope that we grow this field of gender lens investing, that we can say, hey, here's how we're doing it. And others may find that useful as well, and be able to apply similar approaches or develop their own criteria.
So bringing this maybe to a close, I think as we're talking about all of this, just the complexity of endowments, the complexity of investment capital, engaging in investment systems, trying to bridge between a feminist financial imagination and the hard-coded rules of endowments. Like, if I'm just trying to get through the day as somebody leading a small nonprofit, which some days I feel, well, I am actually that most days, but I'm thinking of not me. Like, imagine somebody who sits much more isolated from all these systems, who's, is sitting in, I think about our board member, Rose Orwa, who sits in Kenya in rural areas working on widows' rights issues, and her bridge to the capital markets, her bridge to imagine all of this is she has an extraordinary imagination, so she makes those leaps, but it's hard. And at some point, a lot of people are just trying to get through the day. And so maybe as a final sort of exploration, endowments are a very formal, structured approach that is driven by perpetuity, that's about future problems, not just today. And so thinking about what are some of the other ways, other models that we can use, and we're exploring that in the first part of this, we explored that a little bit, but maybe returning to that again of if our goal is to reduce the risk of being in a long-term mission, right? The sort of reducing the financial risk behind that, which means we're trying to maybe extend time horizons that say, I can think past the next 15 minutes, I can think past this year's budget. But I can also be adaptable. And in many ways, endowments are not very adaptable, right? They are long-term and they could fund adaptability, but they're not adaptable structures. And maybe most important, this sort of belief in a future, right? Because even if the problems that we're facing today are dire, we're only going to get through them if we actually believe that there's a hopeful future that we're moving towards. And so curious what you're brainstorming. We're hearing a bunch of people talking about like pooled reserve funds, right? I got to get through the $80,000 that I need between now to make payroll between now and 6 months from now when I think I'm going to get that grant. And I can't bridge that myself, right? And something like a pooled reserve fund could support that kind of stuff without the complexity, right? That's just a bank account where a bunch of people share assets and say, I'll use it this month and you can use it next month. Not magical, but has the potential to create some interesting collaborations. We're hearing people talk about mergers to actually say, maybe not every organization needs to be going it alone, and can we add shared services and other things that reduce the cost of being an organization, find ways to finance those. What else are you hearing in terms of just, imaginations for something different, that if you were going to start it over, if you were going to start today and build what was needed for today, granted, the Equality Fund was built for moments like this, but what would you be building right now?
Ooh, that's a good question, Joy. I mean, I personally don't actually have the answer to that question because I don't think that answer lies with any one individual. I think some of the ideas that you shared in terms of like pooled reserve funds, what I love about that is, one, it solves a very specific problem. It's a financial of reserves and cash flow management. And two, like such a common story, okay, I have a 3-month gap between this funding that I know is coming and not. So I love that because it's so tangible. And I love this idea of a pooling because that's a very feminist principle, right? And that it sounds very much like, a rotational village loan and savings program, just on an organizational sort of scale, playing a slightly different role in terms of cash flow. So I think those ideas get me excited. That solve really specific problems and that also, use financial tools, but then, adopt them in ways that are much more feminist than the way that they are currently run, where we each have our own, reserves. But I do think, that's why Equality Fund and Criterion, we wanted to have these conversations to generate the thinking and the ideas. I do feel a shift in the conversations that I'm having with folks that, there's a recognition, that in this moment, we both have to be sort of managing the current crisis, but really, the resistance is carving out the time and space to dream about what else we need and what else we can do. And so Equality Fund, we don't have the answer to that, but, we want to be part of those conversations and part of nurturing those ideas. And I think, one thing that we're fundamentally convinced of is that we have to be having those conversations with both our usual partners, but also our unusual partners who we have not yet, made the connection to leverage their assets, their ideas. And so, that's something that I think all of us can be doing in our work, as hard as that is on the day-to-day. And I don't want to understate that, but it is critical.
It's exactly that balance between the pragmatism of a day-to-day, but then also a pragmatic imagination, right? I believe imaginations are also pragmatic, because you're not going to get to something different that works better if you can't imagine it. And to be able to imagine, we need to imagine different models. And I think the struggles that Equality Fund has been through, and, you know, I'll give real credit. I mean, I worked inside of the government on this, and so I saw how hard people inside of the government pushed to say, no, let's try something really different and let's not fall back. And that's also been, I mean, I don't know if the sympathy is all supposed to go for the government, but it's been hard to figure out, to sort of take this brave mode to say, what could we create? And there were a set of people who had an imagination for what was possible and how to navigate through insane amounts of red tape to actually make it happen. And so I think we need to be doing all of those things now for the next crisis, not just to say the moment that we're in right now is the last or even the worst, unfortunately. It's just another. And so how do we keep building for those futures?
Yeah, well, we have to, I think, hold on to that imagination and create space for it, and have conversations like this one to really say, you know, what's working, you know, and what more do we need, and how do we dream that up together. So thank you so much, Joy, for always being game for those kinds of conversations. I've always enjoyed them over our many years of collaboration, and I've certainly enjoyed today's conversation as well.
Thanks so much, Kat.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.